The world's eyes have been on Qatar for the World Cup of Soccer. Now, sadly, Canada will not be advancing to the next round, but it was still pretty cool to see Canada score its first ever World Cup goal against Croatia. Some people would ask, how could a country that has not the best reputation when it comes to human rights win the bid to host the World Cup? To talk about this in more detail is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, who joins us once again from Los Angeles. Lisa, how is it that Qatar was able to land one of the world's biggest tournaments next to the Olympics?
Great question, Hal, and it's not something that most people are talking about right now when covering the World Cup. But what is the backstory as to how Qatar got the bid, how there were so many petitions to try to stop this? Why? Because of Qatar's involvement in global terrorism, the human rights abuses. They don't have exactly the cleanest record. So how did that happen? Well, there's a reason why the expression money talks is so popular. That's exactly what happened. So pay to play. And here we are. I know a lot of Americans, I'm sure Canadians have traveled from this part of the world over there to actually watch the sport, a very popular sport in Europe, in the Middle East, and less so in Canada and the United States. But nonetheless, that's what's going on right now. And many people like yourself and myself who are in the news world, who are following these stories, who are connecting the dots, are not letting up on the backstory as to Qatar's continued human rights abuses, how their stadium was built using help from the Taliban. Also, right now, they are colluding with the Iran regime to crack down on protesters inside Qatar. So imagine that the brutal repression of the Islamic Republic of Iran is continued into those who have gone to watch soccer in Qatar for the World Cup. So a lot to follow here, but again, these are not the stories that we hear coming out of the World Cup. It's more about the excitement of the game, and of course, everyone wanting their home team to win.
Yeah, let's talk about the Taliban's involvement, the terrorist regime. They made millions from the World Cup by providing construction equipment to build the stadiums.
Yeah, well, they are equal opportunity opportunists when it comes to finding partners around the world, and there are not too many, right? So the list of countries that are willing to cooperate with the Taliban is increasingly shrinking, and therefore, if there was an opportunity to help build the stadium, to provide parts, to provide labor, the Taliban was there and willing to volunteer. They're also colluding with China. They're colluding with the Iran regime. They're colluding with Russia. So this is what happens when we try to isolate countries. The side effect of that being that they find each other and they partner up. We do not expect Qatar, who has this World Cup opportunity with so many traveling from the free world there, to be doing this. But again, Hal, when there are no consequences, when nobody's talking about this, when they still were able to land the bid for the World Cup, then they shouldn't worry about where that labor comes from or what they're doing or how they are supporting terror organizations. The one thing I will add about Qatar is that it has always played both sides, both the West and the terror organizations. It has remained on the side of the Iran regime, for example. It has helped the Iran regime circulate funds when the sanctions were very stringent on banking for the Iran regime. But they also maintained their relationships with the United States and the West. And this should be called out if they are going to do this, if they're going to get the World Cup bid, but then to behave in nefarious ways and support terror and human rights abuses, and to bring it into their own country at a time like this.
Lisa, Iran is taking part in the World Cup. Now, according to documents leaked by the Black Reward hacktivist group, Iranian authorities worked with Qatar to suppress any anti-regime expressions during the games.
This is horrific, right? We're talking about this a lot on social media right now, particularly those who are following the Iran protests that have evolved into the Iran revolution. There are a lot of people watching soccer, both inside and outside Iran. There are Iranians in the stadium at the World Cup. What many people don't understand is that these Iranians aren't rooting for Iran's team. Now, for a very long time, Iran's soccer team, as a national soccer team, has been known to be very close to the regime. They're known to be the spoiled children of the regime. Therefore, right now, when the people are protesting the regime, they're also protesting their own soccer team. So imagine when we had the game between Iran and England, many Iranians, even inside the stadium and in Iran, were rooting for the other team. They're rooting for England. It's mind-boggling to think that people would travel to the World Cup and not root for their own team, or they use the opportunity to go into the stadium and hold up the old flag of Iran, which is, I shouldn't call it the old flag, it is the flag of the Iranian people. It has the lion and the sun. It's not the Islamic flag. And many of those people were escorted out of the stadium. Their flags were confiscated. They were told to stop. They were told that they cannot wear the Iran protest paraphernalia, which just says woman, life, freedom, which is the slogan of the current Iran movement. And to think, again, that this would follow them into a place where they thought that they would be free to protest. They would be free to not wear their hijabs, free to hold up whatever flag they wanted to, and to root for whomever they wanted to wear the shirts that they wanted to. And again, the Qatar police force, government, etc., working together with Iran's regime to enforce their own laws on Qatar territory.
Now, Iran called for the United States to be punted out of the World Cup after it changed the Iranian flag on social media to show support for those protesters.
Right. So this is also another crazy story. There's so much, political talk coming out of the World Cup, which is interesting because it's a meeting of so many countries, and yet all these political nuances come out. So Iranian expats protested the use of the Islamic flag for the World Cup. And the United States, what they did in a lot of their promotional material is change the flag to the traditional sun and lion flag. That for a very short time, by the way, because there was protests on the other side to change it back from the World Cup authorities, the United States changed it back right away. Iran's regime then comes out and says the U.S. should be thrown out of the game entirely for messing with our flag and removing the Islamic flag from their propaganda, from their promotional material. So again, a lot of kind of protest and counter protest to what can be done. These what may seem as small, insignificant moves are deemed, very significant on the world stage. And here we have Iran's revolution coming into play at the World Cup, and all eyes will be on the U.S.-Iran game as well to see who they root for. Will they be rooting for the United States? I'm sure, regardless of who they're rooting for, they will be calling on the United States during that game to help support their movement inside Iran and to do more for the protesters who are currently on the streets.
Now, still with sports, this is almost turning into a bit of a sportscast here, talking about all the sports. But Lisa, an 11-year-old female table tennis player was praised by Hamas recently because she refused to play against an Israeli player at a recent tournament in Portugal. It appears like anti-Semitism indoctrination is beginning at a very young age.
Yeah, very young age. And we've seen this often with sports, or whether it's been chess games or wrestling games, and here table tennis, where they use the opportunity to say, we will not sit across from an Israeli opponent, therefore gaining the respect and honor of a terror organization like Hamas that praises a young girl for not being tolerant or not sitting across the table from a Jewish person. It's horrific to think that they are indoctrinating at such a young age, but we know that they are, whether it's in their math books, whether it's in their slogans at school. They're teaching them from the age of 4 or 5. And we've even seen examples of that here in the United States at mosques and other, youth groups that are funded by these extremist organizations that do, in fact, promote indoctrination at such a young age. If you can get them at that age, they'll grow up with it and it'll be part of their DNA. And hopefully they will never accept a Jew, regardless of where they're living or what they're doing. But here you have a young girl taking a stand at such a young age and potentially forfeiting her opportunities, right? This is a wonderful opportunity for her. Obviously, she must be a wonderful player that she's on the national stage like that, international stage, I should say. And for her to forfeit the opportunity just because she does not want to sit across from an Israeli, it's horrific to mix that into their childhood. And here we have yet another example of that.
And we see other examples as well in the post-secondary institutions with Jew-free zones in some of the colleges and universities, including in California.
Absolutely. California has had a big issue with this, particularly at UC Berkeley, which is a state school, by the way, Hal. So you're talking about taxpayer money being used at these schools to bring in speakers who are incendiary, who are hateful, who are teaching Jew hatred and other types of hatred, by the way. And again, taxpayer money going to these schools, and there's nothing being done about it. If you remember, under President Trump, there was a legislation that was signed that was threatening to take away any federal funding from universities who would allow anti-Semitism on campus in any form, particularly with speakers, whether banning certain speakers or inviting certain speakers that would basically, propel this ideology. It's going on more and more. We're seeing it across the United States, of course, throughout Europe as well, and of course in the Middle East. But when you see it in the United States and you see it in universities, places where you think they promote tolerance, they promote equality, they have so many different funds and activities and speakers to promote this tolerance, and yet this is where it is rearing its very ugly head. But I will tell you how it begins and ends with the professors, with the deans, with the head of school, with the chancellors. They're the ones who need to be putting their feet down. They're the ones who should be truly putting an end to this kind of bigotry and not letting it go past a certain level to the students, to the student organizations, and bringing it on campus.
Lisa, U.S. military officials say rockets have been targeting coalition forces at a base in northeastern Syria. Now, fortunately, the attack on Friday resulted in no injuries or damage, but it is still very concerning. Do we know at this point in time who fired the rockets?
Yeah, of course, it's very concerning when you have, not only all eyes on Iran's regime. And I say that because they are the ones who are the bank. They're the ones who are the, rich daddy of the Middle East in terms of funding all of this terror, in terms of funding suicide bombers. They are the #1 world exporter of terrorism, whether it's in Syria or Lebanon or Yemen or Gaza, throughout the world. And no one's talking about it. And while you have protesters on the streets of Iran entering the third month of protests who are trying to bring global attention on the fact that their regime is good for nothing, there's not one good reason this regime should stay in power, whether it's human rights abuses or its funding of global terror, or currently the brutal repression and crackdowns on the people and young people of Iran being murdered for peaceful protest. They're trying to bring our attention to it. And whether it's the UN acting very slowly to call this out, or the United States that just recently pivoted away from very bad foreign policy vis-a-vis the Iran regime when they wanted to make a nuclear deal instead of really calling out these human rights abuses. When you see attacks like this in Syria on Western assets, or again in Yemen or in Lebanon in funding Hezbollah or Hamas or the Houthis, and the list goes on, you better bet that the Iran regime's fingerprints are all over these types of attacks.
The Federal Communications Commission banned approvals of new telecommunications and surveillance equipment from several Chinese companies, including Huawei. Lisa, a good move by the Biden administration, as many would argue they pose a major risk to U.S. national security.
Absolutely. And it's about time, because we have had an issue with telecommunications surveillance, and before that, copycat technology from China's government for a very long time. It had not been called out. We were worried about it not being called out in the meeting between Xi Jinping and President Biden just last week, when we were fearful that many important issues were not brought up in the 3.5-hour conversation. But this is a good move by the Biden administration to at least try or attempt to curb the influences and tentacles of China's government. We know that they have spies here. We know that they have a makeshift police force in New York City working to root out dissidents that live in the United States. We know that they're operating on our college campuses, and here you go with technology, of course, attempting to spy and kind of have a leg up on the United States. I've said this before, Hal. We have Chinese students in the top universities, whether here or in China, learning how to do these things. And in our military, we're learning about pronouns and making sure that we differentiate between pronouns. So there is a huge discrepancy, and it's about time that we wake up to the threat of China's government and what they're capable of doing and what they have been doing while we've been asleep on all of this. So this is a good move, and hopefully more to come on this in terms of curbing China's influence here.
Usually when you think of Mexican asylum seekers, you think of migrants who are making their way to the United States and settling in the United States. But there are apparently refugees fleeing Colima, Mexico, and are making their way to Canada, coming to our country here. Colima is apparently like a war zone with shootings, burning cars, and dismembered bodies being left outside of schools.
You know, this is a growing trend, Hal, and I know you have probably been keeping a finger on the pulse there in Canada, especially at your border with the United States. It seems as though the rumor among migrants is that if you're about to make this trip and you're about to make the sacrifices and risk it all, you might as well keep going north because life might be better on the other side. So a lot of migrants that have been traveling to the United States have been continuing. And past year alone, 8,000 asylees have requested to settle in Canada. That is an exponential jump from the year prior. And authorities believe that that will continue to grow as they continue upward from our southern border here in the United States. They may continue on into Canada. So this is something obviously to keep an eye on. The borders being very hot spots here, north and south for the United States to keep an eye on. Again, accountability is very difficult in this case, and to see just the sheer numbers that we're not able to absorb. It looks like the migrants are taking care of that and finding resources on their own to find and settle in other places.
You know, the more the merrier. We've got lots of room up here, Lisa, and if they open up more Mexican restaurants, I'm all on board that. Absolutely. Our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, thanks so much for joining us today from Los Angeles.
My pleasure.